My friends, let us begin with a truth that has startled sincere seekers for generations, and yet it stands at the very center of spiritual realization. The very moment you take ownership of a problem, the moment you believe you are responsible for solving it, you step out of the presence that alone dissolves it. This is the great misunderstanding of the human race. It is why men and women struggle, toil, pray frantically, and cry out for deliverance, and yet continue to face the same burdens year after year. For we have been conditioned to believe that life presents us with challenges and that it is our duty, through intelligence or force or faith, to overcome them. But this is not the truth. This is merely the human sense of existence, the hypnotic picture that claims we are separate creatures, standing apart from our source, trying with our limited capacities to improve conditions, change circumstances, and repair the broken fragments of our experience. And so the human mind goes forth as a little warrior, fighting shadows and calling the battle real. If you have come here today burdened by a problem, whether of health, supply, relationships, fear, or inner confusion, I want you to listen very gently, very quietly, for what we are about to explore is not a method, nor a technique, nor a system of improving the human picture. No, it is the revelation of a principle. You are not the one who solves your problems, and as long as you believe you are, you will stand in the very doorway through which the presence must enter. The infinite way does not begin with fixing appearances. It begins with recognition, the recognition that the presence within you is the only activity of God, the only intelligence, the only power, and that this presence requires no assistance from the human mind. You see, the human mind looks outward, seeking causes, identifying forms, judging conditions, but the spirit within knows no such thing. It does not evaluate appearances. It does not wrestle with effects. It simply is the one, indivisible, perfect presence of God, forever expressing itself as harmony, wholeness, and peace. Now, in this moment, let us lay aside the belief that you must manage your life. Let us release, even momentarily, the old conviction that you must think your way out of difficulty, pray your way out of darkness, or work your way out of lack. For none of these are spiritual modes of action. They belong to the human sense of self, the self that says, I must do, I must correct, I must change. But the Master taught, I can of mine own self do nothing. He revealed that the human sense of I is without power, without ability, without divine authority. And until we recognize this truth, until we stop trying to be our own savior, the real savior cannot operate. The presence is always here, but it cannot reveal itself while you are busy solving your own problems. So let us begin this journey with an inner relaxation, a softening of the will, a quiet willingness to step aside, not to abandon responsibility, but to recognize where true responsibility lies, not on your shoulders, but in the eternal functioning of the Father within. This is the introduction to our message today. Whatever the problem, you are not the one who solves it. You are not the healer. You are not the provider. You are not the fixer. You are the transparency through which God reveals the perfection that already is. And only when you understand this deeply, quietly, inwardly, does the illusion of burden begin to dissolve. Now, let us go deeper into this matter, for unless we clearly perceive the nature of the I that tries to solve problems, we will continue to be deceived by it. The human mind stands before its difficulties and declares, I must think this through. I must pray harder. I must make better decisions. I must find a way out. And all the while, it is completely unaware that the very sense of I doing these things is itself the problem. This personal I, this little self that believes it is responsible for managing its existence, is not the self that God created. It is not the I am of scriptural revelation. It is not the spiritual identity that is one with the Father. It is an image formed of fear, memory, conditioning, and belief. It is the imposter self, the one that believes it came into life at a certain moment, will depart at another, and must struggle in the brief interval between birth and death to survive, to succeed, to heal, to understand. It is this self that cries, I have a problem. And immediately, consciousness is narrowed into a tiny circle of concern. My health, my finances, my relationships, my future. But my friends, this self does not exist in God. It exists only in the hypnotic sense of separation that envelops the human race. This self is the dreamer in the dream, imagining itself surrounded by dangers and challenges that must be overcome. Joel always reminded us, to personalize a problem is to keep it alive. The moment you say, I am sick, I am afraid, I lack, I cannot, you have accepted a false sense of identity. You have claimed as I something that has nothing to do with your true being. And this false identity immediately assumes it must protect itself, defend itself, and heal itself. But the spiritual I, the real I, has no such burdens. The spiritual I is pure consciousness, pure being, pure presence. It never entered the problem, and therefore it needs no escape from it. It never fell into lack, so it needs no supply. It never became fearful, so it needs no courage. It never suffered, so it requires no healing. The entire drama of struggle belongs to the personal sense of I, and this is precisely why no lasting peace can ever be found through human effort. As long as you believe yourself to be the little self who must overcome conditions, you will live within a cycle of temporary improvements followed by new challenges. The Infinite Way invites you to look at this personal problem solver and recognize its unreality. Notice how it always speaks in terms of my need, my situation, my fear. Notice how it continually reacts to appearances, how it rushes into activity, how it is driven by urgency, impatience, and desire. Then ask yourself, is this the voice of the Christ within me? You will find that it is not. The personal problem solver is a mask worn by the human mind. It is a voice built from centuries of conditioning, and until you learn to set it aside even briefly, you cannot hear the still, small voice that reveals the harmony already established. The Master said, "Take no thought." That is not a poetic sentiment. It is an instruction to lay down the personal mind, to relinquish the false identity that believes itself responsible. For the moment you stop taking thought, the presence begins to speak. The moment you cease struggling, the divine activity moves freely. But as long as the personal I stands at the center, trying to direct the universe, the flow of grace is obstructed. So understand this clearly. It is not your problem you must release. It is the sense of a personal self that has a problem. When this false I dissolves in your awareness, even for a moment, the entire landscape of your experience changes. The burden drops away because the burden was never yours. The solution appears because the presence, not the person, is now governing. This is the beginning of freedom, the recognition that the personal problem solver is not your true identity. And once this is seen, you are prepared for the great revelation that follows. Let us now turn to one of the most misunderstood yet foundational statements ever spoken by a spiritual master. I can of my own self do nothing. Many have read these words, repeated them, even admired them, but few have entered into their living reality. For this declaration is not humility, nor is it a pious expression meant to inspire reverence. It is a spiritual law. It describes the nature of reality itself. When the Master said, I can of my own self do nothing, he was drawing a clear line between the personal sense of self, the human I, and the true self, the Christ, the infinite presence functioning as individual being. He was revealing that the human identity, the one born of flesh and educated through experience, possesses no spiritual power whatsoever. It does not heal, it does not save, it does not guide, it does not supply, it can only react to appearances. This is why the Master never attributed miracles to personal ability. He never said, look what I have done, but always pointed to the invisible source. The Father within me, he doeth the works. Now listen carefully. This same Father, this same presence, this same spiritual activity is within you right where you stand. There is not one presence in the teacher and another in the student. There are not two powers, one divine and one human. There is only the one expressing itself through the degree of awareness that you bring to it. When you attempt to solve your problems through personal effort, you are living as though this great truth were not present. You are, in effect, saying, the Father within me is insufficient. Therefore, I must think, plan, manipulate, and struggle on my own. That attitude is the denial of the very principle by which spiritual healing and harmony unfold. But the moment you accept deeply, sincerely, that I can of my own self do nothing, you do not become weak. You become transparent. You become receptive. You become a clear instrument through which the infinite activity of God flows unimpeded. The human mind steps aside, and the Christ takes its rightful place. You see, this law does not strip you of power. It frees you from the false belief that human power is necessary. The strain of living drops away. The compulsion to manage life dissolves, and in its place, something wondrous begins to happen. An inner stillness appears, a quiet assurance, an awareness of being that knows no fear and carries no burden. Now, many will say, if I do nothing, will not my circumstances deteriorate? Will not everything fall apart? And the answer is this: the nothing that you do is the absence of human will, not the absence of divine activity. When the human self ceases its frantic attempts, the spiritual self takes over, and it does the work far more beautifully, harmoniously, and wisely than the personal mind ever could. This is the very essence of the infinite way, that the presence within you, your true identity, is the actor, the healer, the provider, the intelligence that arranges all things in perfect order. You are not asked to improve your life. You are invited to stand aside and witness the activity of God. The human eye seeks results. The spiritual eye rests in truth. And where truth is realized, results appear of their own accord. This is the law. The human mind can do nothing, but the Father within doeth all things. And the moment you acknowledge this, a shift begins, quiet at first, almost imperceptible, yet profound. You feel the burden lifting, not because the problem has changed, but because the false sense of I has been dethroned. The true I, the I of spirit, takes its place, and from that moment on, the resolution is already unfolding. Now we are ready to explore how this spiritual law leads us to the next great truth, that all problems share the same root, and therefore all answers arise from the same source. As we proceed, I want you to open your consciousness to a truth that may seem, at first hearing, almost impossible to accept. Yet once it is grasped, it becomes the key that unlocks the entire mystery of spiritual harmony. It is this: you do not have many problems. You have only one. Whether it appears as sickness, lack, fear, conflict, loneliness, guilt, or confusion, these are not separate issues. They are merely different costumes worn by a single illusion, the belief in a power apart from God. This is the whole of it. Every problem you have ever faced, every fear that has ever touched your heart, arises from the same single root, the conviction that there exists something other than the one presence, the one power, the one life that is God. The human mind calls this the world, and it believes the world operates on laws independent of spirit. Laws of disease, laws of economics, laws of psychology, laws of conflict and danger. And so it fights these laws with treatments, techniques, strategies, and prayers aimed at changing outer conditions. But the moment you accept two powers, spirit on one side and appearance on the other, you have entered the realm of fear. The moment you believe that sickness has power, or money has power, or human personality has power, or circumstances have power, you are living in the belief of duality, and duality is the only problem you will ever know. This is why the Master declared, "Resist not evil." He was not inviting passivity. He was revealing that evil, meaning any appearance of discord, possesses no actual power to resist. To fight it is to grant it reality. To oppose it is to accept it as something that stands outside the one. And the moment you treat a condition as a power, you have turned your back on the truth of omnipresence. The infinite way tells us that there are not two. There is not God in disease, God in lack, God in conflict. There is only God, and all that appears as discord is but the shadow cast by a momentary lapse in recognition, nothing more. It seems real, it feels real, it frightens and pressures you, yes, but its only substance is the belief that you stand separate from the source of all harmony. Now imagine, if you can, the freedom that dawns when this is fully realized. Imagine seeing every discord as nothing more than a disguise for the same fundamental illusion. Then healing becomes simple. Then prayer becomes effortless. Then life ceases to be a series of crises and becomes a continuous unveiling of the one presence. This is why Goldsmith's work produced so many healings without ever addressing the specific appearance. Whether a person came with cancer or bankruptcy or despair, the treatment was the same. Dissolve the belief in two powers. Bring consciousness back to the recognition of one life, one law, one being. When the sense of separation is lifted, the appearance of discord melts, because it never had existence in the presence of truth. Let us be clear. The problem is never the illness. The problem is never the lack. The problem is never the fear. The problem is the belief that these things have a power, a life, a cause, or a law of their own. The only problem is the belief in a selfhood apart from God. The only remedy is the recognition of God as the only self. Once this is seen even slightly, the so-called problem begins to lose its authority. It no longer stands as an opponent. It becomes a signpost pointing you back to the presence. And as you turn inward, not to fight the appearance, but to recognize the one. The appearance fades into nothingness, for that is what it truly is. Now that we understand all problems stem from one illusion, we are prepared to explore the great turning point in spiritual practice, the entrance into silence, where all resolution unfolds without human effort. Now that we have seen the nature of the problem, that it is not in the appearance but in the belief in a power apart from God, we come to the most essential turning point in all spiritual realization. It is the moment when you relinquish the instinct to wrestle with appearances and instead enter the silence where the presence reveals itself. This silence is not an escape nor a retreat from responsibility. It is the highest form of responsibility, for in this silence, the human sense of self steps aside, and the activity of God begins its perfect work. Let us understand this clearly. You do not enter the silence to get rid of a problem. You enter the silence to recognize the presence. And in the presence of the presence, the problem dissolves of its own accord. When you sit quietly, not seeking, not asking, not pleading, not directing, you reverse the entire pattern of human life. You move from the realm of effects into the realm of cause. You cease trying to manipulate shadows and turn inward to the light that casts the shadows. This is the moment when you stop trying to make truth act and allow truth to reveal itself. The silence is not merely the absence of words. It is the absence of the personal problem solver. It is the suspension of that inner activity which insists, I must think this through. I must pray for a solution. I must somehow compel God to act. All such thought is based in the belief of two powers and keeps the mind bound to the very condition it wishes to escape. In the silence, you let go of the belief that you are the doer. You relinquish the inner tension. You soften the will. You yield, even if only for a moment, to the awareness that the Father within me doeth the works. And as you dwell in this stillness, something imperceptible begins to happen. You may not feel it, you may not hear it, you may not receive any message at all, but the activity of spirit is set in motion. This activity is not the movement of thought, it is the movement of being. It is not the mind working, it is grace functioning. It is not your attempt to change the picture, it is the revelation of what has always been true. Joel often said, do not take your problem into meditation. Take only your recognition of God. For the moment you meditate with the intention of solving a problem, you have placed the problem at the center of consciousness, not God, and consciousness will reflect what it holds. But when you enter the silence with no agenda, with no request, with no desire except to rest in the presence, you have placed God at the center. And where God is recognized, harmony must appear. This inner turning, this movement from analysis to stillness, from personal effort to spiritual receptivity, is the point where healing begins. Not because you have done anything, but because you have stopped doing. Not because you have persuaded God, but because you have ceased resisting truth with mental activity. The silence is the womb of harmony. The silence is the temple of realization. The silence is the doorway through which the infinite enters your experience. Every great spiritual demonstration arises from this sacred stillness. And the more you practice entering it, not to achieve, but simply to be, the more you will find that life itself becomes quieter, clearer, and more ordered. Problems lose their urgency. Fear loses its grip. Decisions become effortless, and solutions, which once seemed impossible, unfold naturally as the flower opens to the sun. Now that we have entered the silence, let us move into the next principle, one that dismantles the very foundation of fear, the recognition that no appearance, no condition, no form has power of its own. This is the liberating truth behind all healing. Now we come to a principle so radical, so complete in its implications, that the entire structure of spiritual healing rests upon it. It is this: no effect has power, whether for good or for evil. Every appearance, every condition, every circumstance is an effect, and effects are never causes. Therefore, they possess no power to create, no power to act, no power to maintain themselves. This is the cornerstone of spiritual freedom. You may look at your body and see sickness, and you may tremble before it as though it had authority over your life. But sickness is an effect, not a cause. It has no intelligence, no law, no substance with which to enforce itself. It is a picture formed of belief, nothing more. You may see lack in your finances and assume that it has power to restrict your life, to imprison you in limitation. Yet lack is an effect, not a cause. It cannot maintain itself. It has no spiritual law behind it. Its only life is the life you give it through fear and belief. You may encounter conflict or injustice in relationships or institutions and feel that they wield a force greater than you. But conflict is an effect. It has no true existence in the presence of one power, one life, one principle. And when you stop attributing authority to it, it dissolves like a shadow in light. Joel often used a simple illustration. Hold your hand before a lamp, and you will see a shadow on the wall. Now try to do something to the shadow. Try to heal it, improve it, strengthen it, or weaken it. You cannot, because the shadow has no power of its own. It is only the projection of a form. The moment you move the hand, the shadow changes, and if you remove the hand entirely, the shadow disappears. So it is with the conditions of this world. They are shadows of belief, projections of a universal hypnotism that causes the human mind to see discord where only God is. And because they are shadows, they cannot be healed by addressing the shadows themselves. They can be healed only by removing the belief that gives them apparent life. Now consider the freedom that dawns the moment you grasp this principle inwardly. If the effect has no power, then sickness is not a power acting against you. Lack is not a power withholding good from you. Fear is not a power diminishing your capacity. Even death itself, as appearance, holds no power over life eternal. This recognition does not ignore the appearance. It sees through it. It refuses to be deceived by what the eyes report. It lifts your awareness from effects to cause, from the picture to the reality behind the picture. And in that shift, the entire nature of the experience changes. The human mind looks outward and says, I must fix this condition. I must alter this effect. But the spiritual consciousness says there is no power in any effect. All power is in God. And the moment the truth is realized, even faintly, the appearance begins to weaken because it no longer has belief to sustain it. This is why Goldsmith never offered formulas for healing specific diseases or financial troubles. There are no specific errors to treat. There is only one error: believing the effect has power. When the effect loses the power you gave it, the illusion collapses. This is the secret behind every spiritual healing across the centuries, not the manipulation of appearances, but the recognition of their unreality in the presence of one power. So now we stand at the edge of a great transition. We have seen that problems arise through the belief in two powers, and that appearances, being effects, have no intrinsic authority. The next step is to shift from trying to fix appearances to recognizing the presence that dissolves the entire illusion of separation. This is the essence of spiritual living, a turning away from the world of appearance and a turning to the presence that is always here, always whole, always perfect. Now we come to the pivotal movement in spiritual life, the very moment when the seeker ceases to be a seeker and becomes an instrument of revelation. It is the shift from seeking solutions to recognizing the presence. Until this shift occurs, all prayer, all study, all meditation is still entangled in the belief that something is missing, something must be achieved, something must be attained. But the instant you turn from seeking to recognizing, you step into the atmosphere of truth where harmony is already established. Seeking always implies separation. The one who seeks is convinced that God is elsewhere, that fulfillment is elsewhere, that peace, supply, safety, and wisdom exist somewhere beyond one's present awareness. And so the mind stretches outward toward people, toward conditions, toward teachings, toward methods, attempting to grasp what it believes it lacks, but the very act of seeking denies the presence. It proclaims without words, God is not here, good is not here, I am not whole. Recognition, however, is the opposite. Recognition beholds the presence as already here, already functioning, already complete. Recognition does not ask, it acknowledges. Recognition does not reach outward, it turns inward. Recognition does not strive, it rests. And in this resting, the truth begins to reveal itself as the very substance of your being. This is why the Master taught, seek first the kingdom, not as a far-off realm to be found through effort, but as the inner awareness of the presence that is always at hand. The kingdom is not a place, it is a state of consciousness. And you enter it not by striving, but by recognizing that you and the kingdom are one. When you shift from seeking solutions to recognizing the presence, a remarkable thing happens. The urgency of the problem dissolves, not because the problem has been solved outwardly, but because your consciousness is no longer identified with the problem. The sense of pressure lifts, fear softens, the mind grows quiet, and in this quietness, the presence announces itself, not as a voice, not as a sign, but as a deep inner assurance that all is well. This assurance is not optimism, it is not positive thinking, it is not mental suggestion. It is the actual awareness of God as the only life and law governing your being. And where God is recognized, there can be no opposing force. The moment you recognize the presence, the belief in two powers is dissolved, and the so-called problem loses its foundation. Now, what does this recognition look like in practice? It is simple, though not always easy. When a challenge arises, instead of rushing to fix it, you pause, you breathe, you turn inward and say silently, without strain, Father, you are here. Or simply, thy presence is the answer. You acknowledge that the solution does not lie in your thought, nor in the outer condition, but in the invisible activity of spirit. As you hold this recognition, even briefly, a shift occurs within. You find yourself no longer fighting appearances. You feel a loosening of the grip that fear once held, and from this inner release, the outer situation begins to unfold in new and unexpected ways. It may take form as healing. It may appear as supply. It may show up as reconciliation, inspiration, or quiet guidance. But the form is never your concern. Your only task is recognition. Recognition is the beginning of freedom because it turns you away from the world of effects and anchors you in the reality behind them. Recognition reveals that the presence is not something to acquire, but something to behold. And the more you practice recognition, the more you begin to see that the presence is not merely with you, it is expressing as your very being. Now, with this understanding, we are prepared to take the next step, to enter into the consciousness that has no problems at all. For once you recognize the presence, you begin to live not as a human seeking God, but as the transparency through which God is revealed. Now, my friends, we come to the unfolding of a state of awareness that transcends the entire problem-solving mentality of the human race. It is the consciousness that has no problems because it recognizes no separation from the one presence. This is not an exalted state reserved for saints or mystics. It is the natural condition of your true being. It is the consciousness of Christ present in you as you, waiting only for recognition. When you begin to live from this consciousness, something subtle yet extraordinary occurs. You no longer meet the world as a human being trying to master circumstances. Instead, you meet the world as the individualized expression of God, through whom harmony reveals itself effortlessly. You find yourself walking through life with a quiet assurance, a calm that is not based on evidence, and a peace that cannot be shaken by appearances. Why? Because you are beginning to see that nothing external has authority over the one that dwells within. Living from this consciousness does not mean you never face challenges. It means you no longer identify with them. They appear as clouds appear before the sun, but the sun is not disturbed by clouds. The sun does not chase them away, nor does it fear their darkness. It simply shines, knowing that clouds have no power to interfere with its nature. In the same way, the consciousness that knows its oneness with God does not panic before appearances. It does not ask, "How will I fix this?" It simply rests in the awareness, I and the Father are one, the presence lives my life. And in that recognition, harmony begins to unfold. Now, how does this look in daily experience? A financial need arises, and instead of racing into anxiety, you turn inward and remember, the source of my supply is the infinite, not the visible. You drop the fear, and ideas appear guidance, opportunities, unexpected channels, not because you force them, but because the presence expresses itself as abundance. A physical symptom arises, and instead of identifying with the body and calling it my illness, you quietly recognize the life that animates this form is perfect, whole, and untouched. In that recognition, fear loosens, the body relaxes, and harmony begins to manifest at its own pace. A relationship becomes strained, and instead of trying to manage personalities or defend positions, you recognize there is only one self here, one life functioning through all. And suddenly, tenderness appears where there was tension. Understanding emerges without effort. The Christ in you beholds the Christ in the other, and healing takes place. You see, when you live from the consciousness that has no problems, you live from the invisible cause, not the visible effects. You walk through the world as an instrument, not an actor. You find yourself responding to life with wisdom you did not think, with compassion you did not plan, with strength you did not muster. This is the activity of the presence. Joel often said, "You are not living your life. God is living it through you." And when this becomes more than a statement, when it becomes your living awareness, you find that even so-called difficulties become occasions for grace to reveal its nature. Life becomes gentler, clearer, more spacious. The fire of fear burns out. The anxious mind grows still. And in that stillness, you finally recognize what you have always been. Not a human being seeking God, but the very place where God shines through. This consciousness is not attained by effort. It is revealed through surrender, through the consistent, gentle recognition that the presence is the only power, the only self, the only life. And as this recognition deepens, you will notice that many conditions that once troubled you simply do not arise anymore. Others arise only faintly, without the old weight of fear, and those that still appear do not disturb the peace at your center, because you no longer confront them as a struggling self, but as the transparency of the infinite. From this place, life becomes a continuous unfolding of harmony, not because you have mastered the world, but because you have stepped out of the belief that the world ever stood apart from God. Now, having understood what it means to live from this consciousness, we arrive at the closing movement of our teaching, the invitation to rest in the presence that accomplishes all things. Let us now explore the gentle transition into that sacred surrender, where the final illusion of burden falls away. And now, my friends, we come to the quiet closing of our time together, not a conclusion, not an ending, but a gentle invitation to step into the life you were meant to live. For everything we have explored points to one simple truth. You are not the solver of problems. You are the place where God reveals himself. And because God is infinite, because God is omnipresent, because God is the very substance of your being, there is nothing to fear, nothing to resist, nothing to overcome. All that is required is rest. Not the rest of sleep, not the rest of exhaustion, but the rest of surrender, the rest that comes when you finally allow the presence to carry the responsibility for your life, when you release the personal sense of I, even momentarily, and let the divine activity unfold without interference. You discover that harmony was always here, waiting for your recognition. Now imagine living from that recognition even a little each day. Imagine waking in the morning, not with the anxious anticipation of problems to solve, but with a quiet trust. The presence goes before me. Imagine meeting the challenges of life, not with strain, but with the assurance, I of my own self do nothing. The Father within me doeth the works. Imagine releasing your fears in the very moment they arise, by remembering no appearance has power, only God is. This is not an ideal, it is a practice, a daily turning inward, a daily returning to the silence, a daily recognition of the one presence living as your very life. And as you continue gently, consistently, you will find that the nature of your experience changes. Not because you have changed the world, but because you have changed the one who looks at the world. You will find your heart softening, your judgments dissolving, your fears fading. You will discover that the people around you seem kinder, though perhaps it is you who has become more receptive. You will find solutions appearing where there were none, relationships healing without effort, supply flowing without anxiety, and you will marvel not at yourself, but at the presence that performs these works through you. The truth is simple. Everything you have ever sought already lives within you as the presence of God, and your entire spiritual journey is nothing but the gradual removal of the veil that hides this truth. So as we close, let this be your contemplation. You are not separate. You are not struggling. You are not alone. You are the transparency through which God is expressing himself. You are the child of the infinite, upheld by the same life that governs the universe. Rest in that. Trust in that. Live from that. And as you do, you will discover that life becomes a revelation not of problems to be solved, but of the presence that solves everything.